to the open side. Karim Bete, up the goal here to Samu, who's quick. Pete Samu looking for Karim Bete. Back to Samu. Oh, that is wonderful. That is wild. That is amazing from the Wallabies.
Hello and welcome to Pick and Drive Rugby, we're the People's Podcast providing a platform for rugby lovers to come together and support the game that's played in heaven. I'm your host Ando, and tonight is a special episode looking at the ins and outs of the financial situation Australian rugby finds itself in with this golden decade of rugby fast approaching. Now, you all know my weaknesses and my strengths, and numbers are not one of those strengths. So to help me crunch those numbers and translate the tables, I have with me David Bond. David, how are you tonight, mate?
Good day, Ando. I'm doing well. Yourself?
I am very excited because I have someone that's far more knowledgeable than me to help understand the stuff we're going to be going through. So I love learning, and I love having somebody actually knowing what they're talking about. So for people who are listening or watching and may not know you and may not know why they should listen to you talk about numbers and stuff, why should they?
Yeah, no, good question. And first of all, just happy to be on here for a chat and have a yarn about all things money and rugby. By way of background, I did a PhD in accounting some many moons ago. So from there, have been teaching accounting for close to 20 years now within the university sector. So that's been a bit of fun. So hopefully I should have some sense of what I'm doing here. Also, played for 16 odd years or so with Northern Suburbs in Sydney. And just by way of disclosure, I'm also on the board of the Sydney Rugby Union. But any commentary around what's going on with PE and whatnot is purely based on what's out in the public domain. Because I actually don't know an awful lot about that from the inner workings, because I'm nowhere near the level of the discussions there. But yeah, I just thought over the years of the research that I've been doing that, enjoy accounting, enjoy, research is part of what I do as well within being an academic, enjoy rugby, and I figured I'd find a way to sort of merge those two things together. So I've been doing a little bit of work around looking at rugby, looking at RA's finances over the last sort of 30, 40 years. And, from that, been able to get to opportunities to chat to people like yourself.
Very exciting, mate. Now, you also have a YouTube channel where you have done some of these types of conversations or videos before. Do you want to quickly plug that and where people can maybe search up some information on previous rugby finance chats that you've done?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the channel is Dr. Dave Bond, so DRDAVEBOND. So it's at YouTube. There's a few on rugby, I think a couple on netball, and lots of just general accounting ones. So if you're wanting to look into any things that we're talking about in a more general sense, feel free to go and have a look.
Brilliant. Well, with that done, why don't we move into the finance conversation itself? So to give everybody listening or watching a bit of context, earlier within the year, I think around April, Rugby Australia dropped their annual report, and there was also the ongoing conversation about private equity, and there was information coming out about, with some more detail about the bid that Rugby Australia are putting out there to find private equity to bring some cash into the game. So with all of that, considering also the fact that we've got the 2025 Lions Tour, 2027 and 2029 World Cup for the men and women being in Australia, and also the Brisbane Olympics in 31, 32. I believe. Oh, 32, thank you for the clarification. Yeah. There's a lot of money coming in. And so I guess the great question that's going to be the big part of our conversation is where are things at now? What are they going to look like into the future? And what opportunities does this present in a broad sense for Rugby Australia? So we're going to touch on a few of those points tonight. But I'm going to start off with a really basic question. When the when the annual report came out from Rugby Australia for the 2022 year, they spoke about an $8.5 million surplus, and they were heralding that as a really beneficial and positive thing, considering I think they were 21 million in deficit the previous year. So why have we been able to turn things around, and is that such a great thing to be heralding at this point in time?
Yeah, well, to begin with, it's obviously better than continuing to lose money or to show losses there. But within a lot of sporting organizations, and this isn't just rugby, this isn't just, rugby in Australia, rugby in New Zealand, rugby to elsewhere around the world. This is, for the most part, sporting organizations. They're not profit. I mean, is useful, but it's not one of the key drivers that you really want to be looking at. And part of that is the way in which expenses can be adjusted. And I'll talk to that. And that's not any sort of accounting sort of dodginess or anything going on, but we'll get to kind of what's happening there. More to the point, and probably the more relevant thing to be looking at is just what's happening with revenue, because that's the thing of which, the money that's coming in, what can they then do with that? Being not for profit, or not being for-profit entities, they don't have shareholders to that extent where they're bringing money in to then provide sort of dividends to them or anything on that front. So money that comes in and profits that they make, they're looking to sort of reinvest it within the business, within the game, to grow the game, to support it, and to move on. For rugby, one of the reasons why they did, of Rugby Australia, I should say, one of the reasons why they did so much better was looking at the three main sort of revenue streams that sports get: broadcast, sponsorship, and match day. So if you look at what those account for, just to give you a sense of it, broadcast over the last 6 years for Rugby Australia has accounted for about 41% of their revenues. Sponsorship accounts for about a quarter of their total revenues, and match day for about 20%. So all in all, those three things make up a just massive chunk of the money that comes in. The broadcast deal, as they came off from Fox, understand that went down a fair bit. Like, that was a bit of a haircut. With COVID, there was less content going out. It was harder to get the money coming through. So in terms of broadcast in 2020, they're only bringing in 25 million. In 2021, it went up to 40. In 2022, it went up to 49. So just the fact there's more content, and as that deal starts to sort of come through, that's been, that increase of $9 million year on year has been important. Sponsorship went up from 22 million to 29 million. So again, like a big increase there. And a big one, and if you look over the last 4 years, so 2019 match day was sitting at 10 million. And match day for Rugby Australia is always going to be lower in World Cup years. There are less inbound tests. Yep. So there's just not the opportunity to be able to hold. Yeah. So if you've got the page up, if people are watching, if you go back a page.
I will. There we go.
Yep, there we go. So that's the one. If you sort of scoot in on that a little bit. Yeah, you can see. Now this is, well, actually in here, this gives you the profit and loss. And unfortunately, and I can talk to it, they actually don't separate out the revenue lines on the actual statement itself. But match day went from 10 million in 29, 12 million in 2020. So you're thinking COVID, not a lot of people were able to get to, not a lot of matches were taking place. Not a lot of people were able to go to matches. 21, it's gone up to 20 million. And 2022, the year we just had, it's gone up to 37 million. So just the ability to actually have people come to the grounds. And that match day figure is about as high as it's ever been. Like, that's, sort of mid 30s, mid to high 30 millions for rugby. And again, Rugby Australia, this isn't Super Rugby attendance. This is Wallabies Test. That's pretty much as good as it's been for rugby in the country over basically forever. So why it's picked up is we've just been able to get more matches being played, more people to matches. Broadcast is starting to come good. So I think that's helped a lot.
Yep.
On the expense side of things, I mean, obviously people were taking haircuts, and there were a lot of people being stood down during that COVID period. Thankfully being supported by the government during that period of time, but it's still not the same. They did slash some of the costs to the super franchises. So though the payments that were being made that were coming in and then going out, and you can see Super Rugby and High Performance, that started to pick back up again. So 21, it was at 19.8, 22 is at 24. But it used to be higher than that going back a few years when they only had the 4 franchises. So per franchise is actually still about $1 million a year less per franchise. So by simply not paying those franchises $1 million each, sort of to get them back to where they were, that's $5 million already that their profit, their bottom line is better off just because they're not going back out.
So jumping in then with a couple of basic questions, it seems like that that positive reporting is basically, in a way, just coming from the low base that was enforced because of the COVID downturn. So then looking previous to that, are we in a good financial position compared to where we were prior to the COVID changes?
Not really. And if you go to the next, not really. If you go to the next page, which has got the balance sheet, and again, feel free to jump in if you've got questions, like, if I sort of jump ahead. But what the balance sheet effectively shows is what an organization, or in this case, Rugby Australia, what they control and effectively own, but control is actually the sort of proper terminology. So that's the total assets they have. You sort of see in the corner there, they've got about $69 million in assets. So that is all the assets that Rugby control. Now, the thing which is a bit concerning, if you scroll down a little bit, total liabilities, this is the total amount that they currently owe, or at least at the end of the financial year. And so total liabilities was $72.9 million. What that means is, and you can see that come up in negative net assets, is that they actually, as of 31st of December 2022, they owe more than they currently control. That's that's not a great position to be in. Now you can see that net asset figure has improved. So if you look at it compared to the previous year, and that's the 1 year we've got before, it was at sort of minus 11-ish $million. So it has improved year on year, and like it was pretty bad for a period there. Also, minus 11. To give you a sense of context, in 2017, net assets was positive 37 million. So we've come down quite substantially. Also, Rugby Australia has gone negative and negative quite substantially over that period of time. And within that, what's happened quite substantially, and they needed to do it to stay alive, is you can see financial liabilities in non-current sits at 30 million, and in current sits at 10. So they're currently sitting on $40 million that they currently in financial liabilities, which they owe as loans. Part of which is the 10 million that they owe World Rugby.
Yep. So that actually leads me well into kind of my next question, which was going to be speaking more about some of the, whether or not there's been any kind of fancy tricks to kind of present a positive narrative within this story. So there is the significant loans that have come in from World Rugby to basically help keep Rugby Australia afloat during COVID, completely understandable. That we've also received some of the Rugby World Cup prepayments, and like you mentioned before, there's been huge cutbacks on staffing and infrastructure. So combined with what you just said, despite the fact that there has been that $8 million surplus, things still are not looking particularly rosy financially for Rugby Australia. Is that a fair statement to make?
Yeah, look, I mean, they'd obviously prefer to be in a better position. I don't think anyone's sort of going to say otherwise on that. In relation to your question, there's a couple of things we look at that sort of help kind of guide an answer to that question. And the first is, and again, so we're external, like I'm external to the organization. I'm just looking at what's publicly available, including this report. They have, like many companies, they have their accounts audited. They were audited by KPMG. Maybe you would be having a different discussion if it was PwC, but I'll leave that to the side. They've got reading through that, they've got a clean bill of health in relation to their audit opinions. So the auditor's gone through and looked at their systems, looked at what they presented. They are comfortable with what is being presented in the financials. Now, there's a couple of small points on that. The other is there's what's called a going, they can make comment around going concern, and there was no, at least from what I read, no comment made around that. So the auditor doesn't have a concern with Rugby Australia suddenly, falling over. So I mean, again, so there's good elements around how they're presenting this information. There's always going to be narrative around management discussion, around how things get put to the media, around how it gets talked about, and that's fine. That's just the way it's always going to, that's the way it's always going to be, not just in rugby and just in everything in life.
Yeah.
However, everything, you talk about the World Cup funding, that's disclosed, that's recognized in there, so you can see it, you can find that information. They talk about the facility that they have, the $40 million facility, of which they've drawn down $25 million already. 15 remains available but unused. That's disclosed. A lot of the information, the information is provided. It's in there if you want to go and, anyone wants to go and read it. So to my mind, it doesn't look like anything sort of being pulled, and any sort of Swifties being pulled in that front. The only gripe that I do have, and this is more from a kind of researcher's point of view, because we've been mapping this stuff for their accounts over the last 40 years, is unlike many companies, they subtly change how they report certain things. So they'll aggregate information. So one thing might be, for example, it might be broadcast and sponsorship might be separated in 1 year, and then you go back a few years and it's combined, so you can't see what was what. They've, in the last couple of years, they've aggregated a little bit more, so it's actually harder in some senses to get some of what's going on. But there's nothing, it doesn't look like there's anything sort of dubious accounting that's going on at all.
Well, that's good to know. And it seems to just paint the picture of, yes, there has been a recovery from what was a really, really challenging COVID period, but we're not in the clear yet. Hence the semi-positive narrative, which actually moves us forward into, like we mentioned, this golden decade for Australian rugby moving forward.
Yeah.
And we all hear about how much money the Lions tours bring in and Rugby World Cup brings in, and I don't think anyone is going to be hiding away from the challenges that rugby union faces in a very packed sporting landscape within Australia. So a lot of people are pointing to the next 10 years as being crucial to the longevity of rugby union within Australia as a professional game. So what can we actually expect moving forward financially from this period? And I know it's going to be hard to predict, say, 10 years into the future, but just general brushstrokes. Should we be expecting huge amounts of money incoming that are going to address those liabilities that we have? Are they going to be able to get covered by, say, the Lions tour? That type of question.
Yeah. No, they're all, really important questions around the golden decade. Obviously, I think a lot is hinging on what this next 10 years looks like for Australian rugby. And I'd say not even necessarily the next 10 years. Certainly the next sort of 3 or 4. There has to be some real momentum being driven off, what's coming up to really start to pick up the pace a little bit, because you look at the competitors, and you mentioned the pack sporting landscape here. AFL, they either have just touched or are going to touch very soon $1 billion in annual revenue.
Wow.
Like you're talking serious money when we're talking, just getting over 100 million. NRL are doing much the same. They're not at the billion figure, but they're sort of 600-700 million. There are behemoths in the room, and unless things start to sort of pick up, it's going to be harder and harder to sort of combat that, especially less so with AFL, but more so, I suppose, with rugby league around that war for talent, and what that does in terms of bidding sort of player prices up and the ability to pay for those. But to get to the question of what this could do, so we don't know what the future necessarily holds, but we can look back at what has happened to give a sense of that. So we'll start with the Lions, given that the Lions is coming up in not very long. Actually, it's not very long now, is it? It's 2025.
No, yep.
Can't believe. I actually genuinely can't believe this year's nearly halfway through. It boggles the mind at how quickly it goes. So the 2013 Lions. Now, the way in which things are set out in their accounts, it's not possible to go, this is just purely driven by Lions. This is sort of other revenue or other costs. But what I did do is you look at what's happened. What would the year before, the year after that, and sort of see what was the bump, both in terms of revenues and also increased sort of costs around match day and whatnot to make this happen. All in all, what seemed to happen, and again, this is purely from an outsider's perspective, in 2013, was that Rugby Australia had a bump of about $39 to $40 million.
Yeah. Okay.
So again, that's what, 10 years ago now. So whether or not, inflation and whatnot, but so it's about $40-ish million. Now that seemed to be comprised mainly of increases in match day. So match day went up from about $35 million usually around that period to close to 70. So match day doubled over that period.
Wow.
So there
Yeah.
was a major bump there. Broadcast went up that particular period by about 13. So they had a reasonable increase in revenues. There was some additional servicing costs, which would relate to sponsorship and whatnot, of about 1 million. And then match day went up by about 8. So, they brought in about an extra $48-ish million, I would say. And it's cost them about an extra 9.
And that's in 2013. So,
That's in 2013.
what would be a realistic, obviously, kind of estimate, not claiming
Yeah.
that this is the gospel truth?
Well, a couple of things to that. Like one, any forecast is always going to be difficult. I'd say I'd be surprised if match day was that increase in match day was that much different. Because I mean, you look at what the match day sort of revenues were in that period of time, it actually is not that different to what we saw last year. So I mean, if you're taking the baseline around how sort of popular rugby was then to now, doubling that, that seems a reasonable kind of assumption. The broadcast is probably the one where it's a bit of an asterisk over, because again, I'm not party to the deal. I don't know if they're going to be how that current deal with Stan is being set out, what the new deal looks like, whether there's additional deals being done with broadcasters up in the UK for access to that. So what that looks like, I mean, we're generally seeing broadcast deals improve in value. So I mean, they seem to get an extra $13 million last year. Could have been north of that this time? Oh, sorry, not last year, 2013. Could have been north of that in 2025. I mean, you'd hope so. I mean, if you were conservative, I mean, I'd say, look, put in between 40 to 50. Let's just pencil that in.
Yeah, good to know. Good to know. Which is very exciting. And I mean, just from a basic thing, that's covering the liabilities that we spoke about earlier, and providing a little bit extra as well, on top of any other growth that the game has during that time. And so then looking forward with the Rugby World Cup in store, do we have any figures of that? And obviously, it's even further in store. But the last time the Rugby World Cup came to Australia, what did that do for the game?
Yep. No, good question. So, yeah, the figures, we do have some figures, and so for Australia in 2003, the revenue, so again, these are 2003 figures. I mean, they'd probably, given how inflation's going, they'd be far north of that now. But $221 million was brought in additional revenue in 2003. The hosting costs were 182. So there was funnily enough, about a $39 million bump in 2003. To give you more recent examples, though, some of this is a bit just because the nation's involved, so it's a bit patchwork. In 2015, the RFU brought in the equivalent in pound, like the Aussie equivalent was about 425 million in revenue to the RFU. In where am I getting to? Then since then, what becomes difficult is, so 2019, haven't been able to, and I guess I probably wouldn't be able to read it anyway, but haven't been able to get hold of the JRFU financials. So I don't know what happened there. But World Rugby also has a place in this all. So just to give you a figure of what World Rugby brought in terms of 2015, 2019, it was, in 2015, these are Aussie figures, about 644 million in revenue, and in 2019, 710. That's the World Rugby element to it, and they also cop a fair bit of the hosting costs as well. So I mean, it's, there's growth. I mean, if you look at if we're taking it really, really simply, 2003 to 2015, it's gone from 220 to 420. I mean, does that double again? I'd say that'd be incredibly optimistic. New Zealand didn't do so well when they hosted 2011. They actually struggled a little bit. And so the ability for people to travel and the size of, the fact that we're quite a distance away, it's a few more years out. I mean, you'd probably be hoping to be more in that kind of 50 to 75 million in terms of bump, but there's a broader element to the benefit from it, is just showcasing the game. The Lions will do that, 27 will do that, 29 will do that, 32 will do that. And that broader piece is probably at least as valuable, if not more so, to the game than just that pure dollar side of things. But the dollars are useful as well.
Well, that provides a very detailed and insightful look into things previously, and obviously then hoping and projecting forward. One thing, I haven't prepped you for this question, but it is fun to sometimes get the unfiltered view. So let's pretend that you're not involved in Sydney Rugby Union, and that you still don't have a role at RA. Where would you love for some of that money to be spent to ensure the growth of the game? Where do you think, from your financial background, that there should be some growth or investment using this incoming money?
I mean, it's not completely taking my SIU hat off, but I mean, for me, I mean, there's you talk to various people, and that whole does high performance drive community, and sort of, and if the Wallabies perform, does that grow the base, or if you grow the base, then that grows the Wallabies? And I mean, personally, and to me, the base is important. And I think probably more important. If you can, kids, boys and girls, are the future of any sport. Like, get them in, get them hooked, keep them invested in the game. Like, that's the way you grow a sport. And the problem we've seen with some of where rugby's at now is because of decisions that were made 15, 20 years ago. And kids just, it's the visibility of the sport, and not all of this. I mean, tough decisions had to be made, but if kids don't know the game and know it's to be played, how is the game going to grow? So I think if you can support the base and community in a way which makes sense, and it's to quote someone previously, just not pissing it up against the wall. But if there is a way to do that and effectively, and support clubs and get kids into the game, get boys into the game, girls into the game, it's a game for all. And I think that's what got me into the game when I was playing, and it's still what keeps me involved in it, because it is one of the few games. And I think as long as kids being active and people being active is incredibly important. And look, whether it's whatever sport, in a way, shouldn't matter as long as you're doing something. But I think the ethos of rugby, which I think has been lost a little bit, is that it is truly a game for all shapes and sizes, all backgrounds. Anyone just can get in and play, and there's a position for you. And I think we need to foster that again. That would be my kind of 2 cents on it. Whether that happens, I don't know. But
well, I found it really interesting. We had the Waratahs kind of development team come out to the school that I work at last term, and I was chatting with a couple of the guys that were there running the program, and about 3 or 4 of the guys there were like 19, 20. They were very clearly kind of uni students, or part of like the Waratahs Gen Blue team or something like that, doing some work on the side. And there was the one development officer, and I was chatting with him, and he was talking about how he was basically one of 2 or one of 3 development officers covering almost all of Sydney. And I just thought to myself, that's an absolute joke. That the ability of our super teams to be getting out on a consistent basis into at least schools is so limited. So I kind of agree. I think we need to have this focus on kind of the grassroots and building the game within schools, whilst also looking at what the top can be doing as well to drive that broader interest and promotion. But anyway, I do just want to jump on now because we've been going for about half an hour now. So I think that we should move to the elephant in the room, which is private equity. So what I might start with is I'll just quickly show for anybody that wants to get a bit of a read up of what we're about to chat about. There is a great article on the Financial Review titled Inside Project Aurora, Rugby Australia's bid to find itself a suitor. So if you just go to Google and type in Rugby Australia private equity article, then this is the first one that will pop up. And it provides a fair bit of detail for people like me about what Rugby Australia has been putting forward. This came out in April, and from conversations that I've had and other things I've read, there's hopefully going to be a decision by September about the private equity deal, is what I've been told. Whether or not that's true or not is something else entirely. So, first off, for people that have little to no background in kind of investment within sport, what is private equity and why would Rugby Australia be looking to get private equity in the game?
I mean, it's an additional line of, they're looking for cash. I mean, ultimately, that's, they've got a debt facility, and we spoke to that. Now, is it why they're looking at it's providing additional investment into the game with often an ownership stake attached to that. And so New Zealand, partially why they're doing it this time, I think they've seen New Zealand rugby go off and do the same thing. And how that's popped up on New Zealand rugby's books is they've got $100 million additional debt now sitting on their books. I mean, we talked about RA being slightly, if you work out the numbers, is about 104% of liabilities to assets. New Zealand's at about 93%. So I mean, they're not actually dissimilar in that sense. What that deal in New Zealand does, and looking at reading through their accounts, is that debt is convertible after 3 years, or there's some other sort of triggers in there as well. But let's just say it's, if that private equity partner wants to take an equity stake in the business in 3 years' time, they're able to do that. So it's not going out and just borrowing money where you pay a fixed amount of interest. There is, and what you've got sort of picking up here, if you scroll down a little bit, and again, this is in terms of Project Aurora. Like, again, I've got no inside knowledge at all in relation to it. This is it. Although I did, based on this, I went off and just had to crunch through some of the numbers because there are a couple of things in there. Oh, that's interesting how they split that, which I'll get to in a sec. That distribution of 20%, that distribution is based on, so what they get is a cut of the profitability of it. So it's not just a flat rate of whatever it is. So I don't think rugby, given that they're now at over 100%, over 100% liabilities on assets, actually have the ability to really tap any more borrowing. They can't. They're not a company. They're also not in a position to, they're not listed, so they can't go and issue new equity to new people to, if you want to buy shares in them, like that's not possible. So this is another route to be able to do that. And the why is, one, they are getting pretty tight on cash and that ability to service the debt that they have. And two, I suppose they've seen it just happen across the ditch. And again, that's purely from the outside looking. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's obviously going to be more nuance to that, but that would be, in a slightly simplistic kind of view of it. And there's the opportunity to do it.
Look, it's interesting because private equity is something that for novices like me seems a little bit dodgy, because you're selling off a portion of your thing in order to get money now but lose revenue in the future, essentially. Is that it?
Yeah. And no, I mean, but that happens in so many spheres of life. It's not the idea of it. And it was, like, think about privatization in the government space as well. When you take a privately owned, when you take a government asset, whatever that happens to be, and you privatize it, that is exactly what you're doing. You're getting a lump sum now to lose out on that future income stream or whatever that entity, Telstra or Telecom, whatnot was, as an example. That idea is, if the pricing is done right, now there's a question about getting that right, but if the pricing is done right, then it could be really good, or it could be really, and the conditions around it could be really good, or it could be really bad.
Okay.
So, if you're going to have someone pay you $1 billion for a really small income stream that you're losing, that's great. Like, that seems like sort of a pretty straightforward decision to make. But if someone's going to only pay you $50 million for, a couple of $1 million in revenue or income each year, then maybe not so much. Like, it depends on where that price point is and what's being given up, which again, I don't know.
Well, I guess a part of it, I'll touch on this before we get back into kind of the proposed transaction structure, and then we kind of might start getting to the end of our chat. But there has been a fair bit of concern about equity going into, say, the Premiership through CVC. And we have Silver Lake in New Zealand. And one of the big concerns that has been touted in terms of the Premiership funding is that only 4 or so years ago was when CVC bought into the Premiership, and the clubs received a pretty significant financial windfall. And yet, since that time, and it's only in the last 8 months or so, we've had Worcester Warriors, Bath, and now, as of this last week, London Irish go under. Now, the circumstances are slightly different, and each of the reasons why those clubs has gone under is different. So, as an example, there's a really good article by The Guardian talking about London Irish's demise, which I've just put up on the screen. But they speak specifically to the fact that their wealthy benefactor basically just couldn't handle the losses anymore in the current economic climate and has pulled out. And so that is primarily the reason why that team's gone down. But going back to it, I mean, look, if private equity is meant to be providing this injection of cash, surely there must be some risks associated with it. There just seems to be some unease, at least within my mind and people that I've been chatting with, about what this might look like, giving away some of the autonomy of Rugby Australia moving forward.
Yeah, look, there's those, as you pointed out, there's been some really bad scenes in relation to the Premiership, and a number of clubs going under, and that has financially, and for the club, it's obviously incredibly harmful. For the competition, it's harmful, but it's also for all the coaches, staff, players, families that are involved in that, and a lot of people have there are a lot of expats and international players that have moved to play at these clubs, have signed, and that's damaging to everyone. So I mean, it's hard to see that happen and the impact that has on individuals. I think there are some differences now. Not knowing, so the CVC, not knowing exactly what money, because they're all private, so it's a little bit harder to sort of get eyes into things. But if you, as an example of this, so the clubs, the 12, I think the Premiership clubs had, I think they had a 74% stake in the Premier, whatever the name of the actual company that ran the Premiership. So it wasn't the RFU involved with it. CVC had a sort of 25% stake. Now, I don't know how much funding went through that 300 odd million through to each of the clubs. But one of the problems, and the thing when I spoke to someone about this last year, was I just couldn't square how the clubs were could ever be profitable. And the reason I say that is if you go back to the top, where the 3 main income streams are not top of that, the top broadcast, sponsorship, match day. What are the big revenue, big expense items for clubs? I mean, now we're not talking RA, we're talking whether it be sort of Waratahs down here, whether it be NRL clubs, whether it be Premiership clubs, is going to be player costs, and then staff associated with that are going to be big elements to that. They're not worried about game development. That's an RFU thing. Like they will to some extent, but they're a professional club. Their attendances, their salary cap for players, just to give you a sense of this, the salary cap for players is about the same in the Premiership as it is for the NRL. So where it sort of sits. So they're paying for the squad, they're going to be paying about the same. In terms of match day, from what I could see of attendances, they're actually not dissimilar to most NRL clubs in terms of attendances. In terms of sponsorship, I can't imagine there'd be that much different. But the broadcast, which is a big chunk of the pie, the NRL pours in sort of $500 million a year in terms of broadcast. From what I could see from the Premiership, you're talking, I think it was $110 million, £110 million 3-year deal. So you're talking about £30 million.
Yep.
Let's say double that to 60, sort of $50-60 million divided. Like, a lot of the cost structure will be the same to run a professional club. The match day and sponsorship, I'd imagine, wouldn't be all that dissimilar, but broadcast is just way smaller. Yep. And if you just shrink a major part of the revenue stream, you're still paying for players to get out on the pitch. I think you have to have wealthy benefactors. Again, I've not seen any of their annuals, but I can't see how any one of them would be turning a profit. And that's why having a wealthy benefactor is crucial, which is why when they pull out, they go, well, that makes it hard. Rugby Australia is not in that boat. Like, it's been there, it's survived, it's going along. Might have to shrink operations, shrink what it does, but it's sort of, in a way, it's able to do that. It might have drastic ramifications for the game more generally if it shrinks too much, and then there's no one really sort of, there's nothing really to sort of aim for at that top end. But I don't think what we saw with, say, Worcester or London Irish is realistically on the cards here.
Yeah. Yep. Well, why don't we quickly jump into the transaction structure and what that might look like, and then I think we'll get to the point of wrapping up our conversation. So, from what we have seen in the Project Aurora documentation that's at least publicly available, there is a proposed transaction structure with RA Co and New Co, with RA Co basically covering player salaries and RA costs, whereas New Co will cover all costs, including match day and sponsorship costings, and the revenue streams will be for New Co broadcast, match day sponsorship, licensing, royalties, etc. Whereas for RA Co, it will be things like anything that comes outside of New Co, like World Cup, Olympics, and government and community funding. So can you talk us through why there are these two entities, and basically explain what these entities are trying to achieve?
Look, it's separating it out. So when they're working with private equity, like, they'll take their kind of connection will be with not the whole of IRA, or be with one of those entities. New Zealand have actually done much the same. They've actually set up a separate vehicle, and that is where the private equity is connected to. Now, why they've chosen what they've chosen here, now again, remember those three things around where the main revenue is coming from: broadcast, match day, sponsorship. Where do they all pop into? They pop into New Co. I had to make some assumptions here, but I sort of had a bit of a play around with, like, what I could see, and there's some ambiguity. And look, this is just a back of the envelope type calculation. But in terms of revenues, so revenue for 2022 for RA was 129. New Co, as based on what I sort of roughly could figure out, and some assumptions there on things where I couldn't figure out, I just split them 50-50. Of that 129, 119 of that would pop into New Co. Only 10 mil of revenue for 22 would go into the RA side of things. So just park that figure for a second. But when it comes to the expenses, as far as I could figure out, it's a little bit, actually it still works out pretty well for New Co. So New Co cops, again, based on what I could, there's a lot more ambiguity here where things sit. I could see about $38 million in expenses. So 119 of revenue, so the lion's share of the revenue, and $38 million of costs, whereas RA Co would have $10 million in revenue and $77 million in costs. So what they've done there is just they've separated out. So most of the costs of running because of running RA kind of fall in RA Co. What that means is, this is a pro forma, and again, lots of caveats around it. So the profit for RA Co would be a loss of about 67 million. The profit for New Co would be about 80 odd. And if you're taking that distribution of 20%, that's $16 million. That's, I would hazard, they're trying to get as much as the revenues and the sort of commercials into that side of things to make it like, and yeah. So, I mean, it's a way of funding. If they're going to get $250 million, if they're paying, it's obviously the positive is, in a way, is like, if things aren't so rosy in a particular year, then that will sort of ratchet down how much that distribution is, which is positive. But it still looks like a fair chunk of money will be sort of going out to pay for that 250 million.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what does that mean moving forward then? Like, what's the impact of that moving forward? Does it mean, I don't even know how to unpack what you've just said effectively.
Look, I mean, if it means, well, I'll take it back a step. One of the things New Zealand did initially, so they got that 200 odd million, that lump sum that they got. They upped investment in competitions, so a lot of their line items, game development competitions, the spend on them went up massively. So game development went from 30 to 41 million. Competitions went from 81 to 137 million. Like, the teams in black, which is obviously the high performance teams, went from 57 to 78. They're just able to throw money at building that, in many cases, building that base. They also set up a strategic fund, short-term strategic fund, which they put 37 million into, to then just roll out. And I think as of the end of the financial year, 30 million had already gone out. And so that was to small clubs all around the place. That's a fair chunk of money that just goes straight in. And if it's used wisely and well, that's kind of coming back to your unprompted question. That's the sort of thing which it can be used for, and if managed effectively. Yes, there's a cost to it, but I mean, like, everything does have a cost to it. So it could also be, and there's lots of, if it's done well, it could be the thing alongside the 25 and the 27 that ignites or reignites the game in the country. And I really hope that's the case, because it kind of needs something. Yes, there's risk there. But I also don't necessarily see what the plan B is. Match day is kind of where it's going to be out. Broadcast, hopefully will go north a little bit. Sponsorship, I think, could go north a little bit, but you're not talking major turns of the dial there. It just sort of seems to be, this is the environment we're in right at the moment. And if this could be the best course of action given what has happened.
Well, I think that's probably the point at which we can wrap up our conversation, because it does speak to the, I guess the opportunity that lies ahead of Rugby Australia and Hamish McLennan and now Phil Waugh, for the decisions that they're going to be making moving forward over the coming few years. And for those of you who've listened to our conversation with Gilly Collins as well, the GM of Women's Rugby at Rugby Australia, that was a really great chat around what this period can mean for women's rugby too. And so there's a lot on the horizon. And hopefully we will find out more about things like private equity, about the roadmap that Rugby Australia have for developing the game moving forward, both men's and women's. And hopefully that'll be coming out in the coming months. So, David, thank you so much for your time. Just one more time, if people are wanting to find you or devour a bit more of your content, where should they look?
Yeah, just go onto YouTube, and it's Dr. Dave Bond. So DrDavebond.
Brilliant, mate. Well, thank you so much. It's been great to have a chat.
All right, Ando, no, really appreciated. Thank you.
Awesome. All the best, mate.
Cheers.